So, I'll tell you, like the last couple of weeks has been tough, both for good reasons and unfortunately for very bad ones. The good reasons were Yontif, the holidays, which were nice until they became unfortunately not so nice. And last week, I'll be honest, I simply just did not have the heart to teach Rambam, and which kind of brings up in my mind something that we were going to address at some point, so I guess we might as well address now. And that is that often when one thinks about thinkers like the Rambam, um, and and especially we're studying his major work of philosophy, we start to think about, it's philosophy can be very interesting, it could be enlightening, it can teach us all kinds of things about how to think about different complicated issues, but it's hard to relate it to our emotions, to our deep, deep emotions when we're hit by something emotionally powerful, such as the horrific tragedies that we're experiencing today in the land of Israel. And it's hard to know, like, how it's just how a philosopher like Rambam would even, like, how he would, what should we learn? Like, it's just hard to relate. It's hard to make that connection. It's easy, and one of the things that people say is to pray. So we can say to Hillel, we can pray, we can daven before God, we can cry, we can scream, and that has like an emotional connection to us. But to be honest, though, it doesn't have an intellectual connection, right? Because intellectually speaking, what does me going to shul here in America, whether I'm in Leavenworth, Kansas, or Birmingham, Alabama, or Washington D.C., um, what does that do? Like, how does that change anything? How it makes me feel good to think that, oh, if I daven, if I pray, well, then maybe God will help the situation. But for those of us that have been studying Rambam until now, we've seen that, I mean, logically doesn't really explain how to feel, how prayer works according to Rambam and according to rationalists in general. I mean, Rambam made it extremely clear over and over again. We can't change God, and trying to change God is blasphemous, if anything, and trying to make God change his mind, so to speak, doesn't work. So and then, but that makes it even harder because it leaves. So what can I do? Like, how can I change things? So that's something that, it's a problem that I have a lot, because that emotional part of me wants to connect my heart, to to God, and I want to pray to Him. I want to talk to Him as if I'm carrying on a conversation. That's a two-way street, you know. So if something's, I want to be able to pray and then hope that He'll answer. And then philosophy, especially Rambam's philosophy, takes that away from me. Now I can't ask God because He doesn't answer me according to Rambam. So how does it work? And unfortunately, this is a huge question, and I do want to hear what you guys have to say about this. But um, the the answer. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I'm starting to slowly get a little bit more of a handle on an answer. And there's this book, it's not easy to find. There's several people have dealt with this question of Rambam's philosophy of prayer, like how prayer works and what it is. One of them is this book here it wrote it in the 1990s. It was really it's a philosophical, but academic work. It's called Worship of the Heart. I don't know if you could see it. A study of Maimonides' philosophy of religion, by Ehud Benor, Benor. I don't know if you could see it. It's I think I found it on Amazon somewhere. It might not be that, but I'm warning you before you even buy it that it's not an easy read. It's very academic philosophy, and I don't have a PhD in philosophy, so I literally have to work through every single page, read it several times to try to figure out if I'm really understanding what he's saying. However, it's really a book specifically addressing this question, is because Maimonides, on the one hand, he writes in the Moreh Nevuchim that, we can't change God's mind, so to speak, by praying to him. We pray to him, but the concept and the whole idea of God answering our prayers doesn't really make sense in Maimonidean philosophy. On the other hand, the Rambam wrote all the laws of tefillah and the Mishnah Torah. And the Rambam famously argues on Ramban and holds that the obligation that we have to pray is a Torah obligation. It's a Torah-based obligation according to Rambam. And so it's a fundamental part of Judaism is the obligation to pray. And the Rambam writes all of the rules and how we're supposed to pray and when we're supposed to pray. And the words of the prayer, for anyone that's opened the Jewish prayer book at any time in your life, if you bothered thinking about the translation, there's a lot of petitionary prayer in there of us as usually typically it's us as a community asking God for things. So how does that all work? So just a little bit of a beginning, and we did touch on this before, but a little bit of a beginning of a way of understanding is Ehud Benor, the writer that I'm mentioning to you, emphasizes how Rambam holds that that which Chazal say often. They call the tefillah is avodah shebalev, the worship, the service, but in our heart, right? So Rambam therefore looks at prayer as a service that we, so to speak, give to God. Now, of course, God is not here to receive anything. So what does that even mean? So the prayer is therefore a process by which we recognize and inculcate into our souls and our hearts the fact that God is the source of everything, right? That God is the creator, that God is beyond what we can imagine, beyond what we can control or even petition, right? And prayer is therefore that process. It's the avodah shebalev, it's the worship, right? It's the process by which we come to this intellectual, and then therefore Rambam emphasizes this emotional realization of the incredible grandness and incredible majesty that God represents, and through that, right, it's fixed in the way the world works. That when people go through that process emotionally, first intellectually and then eventually emotionally, that it does make the world better. It does make things better. Now, on a simple level, how does it make things better? Because we become better as a people, right? So yes, we can get together and pray. And yes, we are praying to God in the sense that the process of prayer is us bringing ourselves to the realization of God as the source of everything. God is the creator of everything. And then we become overawed, and we therefore learn to do and act like God would, right? Imitatio Dei, so to speak. In other words, to express those behaviors and those emotions and treat people in the way that God would have. So in essence, prayer does bring about good in this world. So that process is a very valid response, right, to a tragedy like this, because not because when I go to a shul, according to my Maimonidean look, that I'm going to pray to God, or we're all going to call really loud to God, and then he'll answer if we say it really loud. But no, but if we as a community get together and approach God in this way, the community will be better. And this is why Rambam so strongly emphasizes on things like when he talks about the laws of prayer on a fast day, right? The Rambam emphasizes the point that if you just go and fast and pray, that's nothing. You have to go and fast and pray as a community, right? And then give money to the poor and find out what's wrong in the community and make peace people with one another and so on. So and that's the change that comes about because of the first intellectual and then emotional process that we go through when we pray. So so it does work. Prayer does work, right? But not in the sense that we sometimes are led to believe. It works because it changes us, because we are worshiping God when we do it, and we are recognizing the ideas that Rambam is trying to teach us. I know this is not a complete, full, 100% answer, but it's like I'm like 2 chapters into the book I showed you, and that's what I've gotten so far. It's hard work, but yes, those are
Saul,
that. Yes, go ahead, please. Feel free to
is this the book, Worship of the Heart is by Soloveitchik?
No, that's another book. It's also a good book, but it's not the same one.
Who is the author of the one you're talking about?
His name is Ehud, spelled in English Ehud, last name Benor, Benor. It's not a very popular book. It was printed in more academic circles. The one by Rabbi Soloveitchik of Worship Thought is also a very good book, very worth reading, but it's but it's much more well known. This one I kind of dug up through scholarly notes. This people said to look at Ehud Benor, but if you can find, I found it on Amazon, so it's findable. You just have to look for it. Anyway, Jeffrey, I saw you raise your hand, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
Then why are we led down this primrose path? Why did the Talmud and all of our training until we come and learn from you tell us that yes, God hears and God will answer our prayers?
So I'm not going to fully answer that question because I'm still working on this, right? But I will begin to answer that question because there's several pronged answers. One way of looking at it is there's different opinions, right? And I tend to kind of lean in that direction. Like I think that these two, I'll call them two different approaches, but there's much more than two. But the two basic approaches are that we pray and God answers versus the idea of Rambam that we pray and the world and we make things better because we go through the process of prayer, right? Are two different worldviews, and both have origins in the Talmud and prior to that in Tanakh, right? And that they're both competing understandings, and sometimes many of us might fade between one and the other, like some of us might be a little bit more A and a little bit less B, some of a little bit more B and a little bit less A, but that's one way of understanding it. Others will claim that the Rambam would have said that no, that this is consistent with the Torah all the way back, and it's consistent with Chazal. And when Chazal make statements that sound like petitionary prayer works in the more traditional sense, that's not what they meant, then he'll explain it in different ways. And one way of kind of understanding that it was like built into the world, that's how it works. When you pray, God answers, not because that's what actually happens, but that's what happens. you know
Is this
so
part of the general thesis that we have to dumb down Judaism to go to where people are, not to where they should be?
that's kind of part of the second approach, that I just mentioned. Second, yeah, that we're dumbing it down because a lot of people want it that way. I mean, so many people want to believe that I could just pray, I could give tzedakah, and then things are going to get better. And the thing is that things do get better. That's the thing. When we pray and we give tzedakah, right. The mechanism is a different question altogether, though, right. When we go and do mitzvot, right, and do the rules that the Torah put out for us, the world does get better, right? But according to Rambam, and we'll see it as we continue learning through more Nevuchim, especially in the third chelek, which at the rate we're going, we'll get there in about 2 years, right? Um, Especially in there, we'll find that keeping the rules of the Torah and prayer and everything works because it's just logical. It makes sense, right? If we keep those laws, the world will get better. But on the other hand, it's not in this magical sense, you know. Uh, but anyway, yeah. So it's difficult. It's really hard, you know. We all wish that having a community gathering, will somehow change God's mind and bring mercy upon Israel and everything that's happening there, and bring a as peaceful an end to this as can possibly be. Because I mean, it's just not peaceful. There's no way there's nothing good about what happened. But hopefully, bring it to some conclusion that doesn't result in more innocent loss of life, and suffering, and bring people home to their families and everything. It's just it's just not. We'd like to think we can pray and make that happen, but I'm not. But we should pray and we should make it happen. but 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 in kind of the way that I was explaining it. I hope that makes some sense. It's not super satisfying, but maybe it wasn't meant to be satisfying. Maybe life was never meant to be simple and easy. So I mean that's I wanted to start with that because I simply it's impossible to not talk about these kinds of issues with what's going on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How does Maimonides assert, on what basis does he assert that God doesn't respond to prayer?
Well, because his philosophical understanding is that God cannot be changed. God cannot
Well,
be changed by things that we do, right? And if God changes his behavior in response to our actions, then that's philosophically untenable. The Rambam would consider that heresy, right?
hmm,
In other words, the only way Rambam understands it is if hardwired into the nature of the world is the fact that if you do X, Y is more likely to happen, right? And if you don't do X, then Y is more likely not to happen. That the Rambam is able to accept, and that's how the Torah works, right? The world works in such a way that if we do X, right, we keep the Torah's laws. So we give a tenth of our money to charity, and we don't lie and cheat and steal, and we treat each other with respect, and we don't murder, kill, and shoot and beat each other up, and we follow the ways that the Torah teaches us, and we follow the ways that science teaches us, because Rambam wrote numerous books on medicine to tell us we should eat healthy and eat right and exercise, so on and so forth, right? If we do all that, then the world will be better. Simple as that, but not because of some kind of miracle, but because that's how God made the world work. And I mean, on a certain level, it's true. A lot of people have written. I heard James Diamond. He writes a lot of books on Rambam, and I have some of his books. I think I've quoted him a few times, but I think he's in the process of publishing, or he just published a whole book where basically, I mean, which deals with the fact that Rambam after the Holocaust is a lot harder to read. Is essentially the thesis of the book, because how do you I mean, how would Rambam, because when we are going to get to Rambam's understanding of evil, but we're going to be hard pressed to have it explained the incredible levels of evil witnessed in the Holocaust. And I dare say, even though on the scale and the size of what happened, it certainly doesn't compare to what happened a couple of weeks ago in Israel, but on terms of the brutality and the suffering, I think one can compare the two, not in the numbers, but in the sheer awful, awful suffering and brutality. It's not an unreasonable comparison, So such suffering is the question is like, why, how the Rambam would deal, how would that fit into his philosophy of evil? Which I promise you, I should, assuming that this class continues, and I certainly intend on continuing for many years to come until we finish the book, we'll get there. Somebody else want to say something? If not, I'm going to go ahead and do chapter 14. Okay, so we're on page 285. So part 2, chapter 14 of the Moreh Nevuchim. And if you recall, in the last chapter, Rambam laid out 3 views. Actually, he laid out 4, but the 3 main views as to how the world came to be, basically. Right. The first view is what Rambam identified as the view of the Torah, which is what we often call in Hebrew yesh me'ayin, or ex nihilo in I guess Latin, or something from nothing, which is, I guess, I don't know. I think there must be a better term in English than that, but in other words, that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, and then except for God himself, whatever that even means. And then God decided for whatever reason, now there's going to be a universe, right? That's ex nihilo. The second opinion was what Rambam identified as Plato's opinion, which is that there was a time when there was just raw materials floating around. There was stuff, whatever essence the world was made of, was always around. And then at one time, God said, you know what, I'm going to take all this stuff, and out of it, I'm going to assemble a universe, right? That was the second opinion. And then the third opinion was Aristotle's opinion, which is that the world is the way it is, and always was the way it is, and always will be the way it is, and that's just the way it is, and finished. It's like it is today because that's how it was yesterday, and yesterday it was that way because that's how it was the day before, and it goes all the way back. And don't ask me about when did that stop, because it doesn't matter. It's just all the way back. And then the fourth opinion that the Rambam mentioned, but he didn't even consider worth giving a number for, was that of Epicurus, which is the idea that it's all just one big happenstance. Who knows? Who cares? Doesn't matter. It just is. Just forget about it. This is the world, like it or not. There's no creator. It's just that's the way it goes. The world is. Anyway, so those were the four opinions, and we're gonna now focus on Aristotle's proofs. Now, I'm sorry, I don't have my whole library in front of me right now, but at home I have a book written by Menachem Kellner, who I've quoted numerous times, on the Rambam and the creation of the universe. And in that book, he describes these chapters are it's kind of like an in-depth book on these chapters that we're studying now. But the bottom line of Aristotle, before we're about to read in chapter 14, Aristotle's proofs to the eternity of the universe, right? And one of the most basic assumptions that Aristotle is making, I remember, by the way, these are Rambam's version of Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus. Those thinkers over the years have had numerous commentaries and numerous writing, and it's questionable whether or not these are actually the views of Plato and Aristotle. But for our purposes here, that's an academic question, which I'm not going to go into. But if you are interested, you can see that whether or not this is actually what Aristotle believed is a different question entirely. And if you are an Aristotelian scholar, you might beg to differ with Rambam and say that Aristotle said something else. But for our purposes in Moreh Nevuchim, this is what Aristotle said, right? And it's also consistent pretty much with what most of the Islamic neo-Aristotelians in Rambam's day, how they understood Aristotle as well. But anyway, so the bottom line that Menachem Kellner points out when he discusses these chapters is that Aristotle makes the assumption that the laws of physics, the way Aristotle understood the laws of physics, are fundamental, right? So that those laws of physics don't change, right? So if I view something and I prove to you that this is the way it works today because, this is what happens, right? Right? With today, we would explain it with whatever law of physics you wanted to use, that law of physics is fundamental and it always therefore had to be. So if he goes to explain a creation, right, Aristotle is going to have to explain the creation according to the laws of physics that Aristotle knew and understood to be true, right? So this is a fundamental thing, because we're going to find that Rambam's problem with Aristotle is exactly that. What makes you think, because at the time of creation, right, there were no laws of physics, right? When God created the world, according to the Torah view of ex nihilo, God also created the laws of physics. Those laws didn't exist before the universe existed. That's going to be, and I know I'm jumping the gun, but that's going to be Rambam's fundamental argument with Aristotle, right? Aristotle, according to Maimonides' understanding of Aristotle, every single one of these points, pretty much, maybe with some exceptions, but you'll see as we go through them, all make the assumption that this is the law of physics, this is how it is, so therefore that's how it always had to be, and therefore the world has to be eternal. So let's go and do it. Chapter 14, I wanted to make that point because you'll see as we go through. And it's fascinating because nowadays, this similar debate could be had when we're discussing modern physics and whether or not there's a creation ex nihilo and the Big Bang and all that stuff. But we'll get to that. So I do not need to repeat. I'm at 285, chapter 14. I do not need to repeat in every chapter that I compiled this treatise for your benefit only because of my knowledge of your achievements, right? Right? In other words, Rambam, remember, this book was written to his student. So he's reminding his student or anyone reading it, right? Right. I know you're a philosopher. I know you read. I know you got Aristotle, right? So I don't have to, I know that. I do not need to set forth in every passage the text of the Discourse of Philosophy, but only their intentions. So I'm not going to sit here and waste your time and go through all of Aristotle's books to make my point. I shall not write at length, but only draw your attention to the methods and they aim at, as I did for you regarding the opinions of the Mutakalamun. If you remember, at the end of book 1, the Rambam laid out like a whole bunch of arguments of the Mutakalamun, who were an Islamic group of philosophers, and then he knocked them out, right? At least the Rambam felt he did. That was back at the end of book 1. So I shall pay no attention to anyone who, besides Aristotle, has engaged in speculative discourse. I'm not even going to bother with the myriads of other philosophers And by the way, Avicenna, who he quotes many times, he's not going to quote here, but a lot of what he says is a similar understanding of Aristotle that Avicenna had, who was one of the chief Islamic philosophers a couple centuries before Rambam, who kind of set the stage for Islamic understanding of and all the whole new Aristotelian movement, of which the Rambam is very prominent. So I shall but the bottom line is I'm thinking about Aristotle because it's his opinions that ought to be considered. If there are good grounds for refuting him or raising doubt with regard to these opinions on some point, so then then these grounds will be even firmer and stronger with respect to all the others who disagreed with the fundamental principles of the law. So in other words, Aristotle is the best of them all. So if we can disprove him, then our disproofs against the other guys who weren't as great as Aristotle will be even better, because if we can knock Aristotle out, then we can knock anybody out, is basically what he said. It's like, if you beat the best team in football, then you can certainly beat the second best and the third best. Right. So I say then that Aristotle asserts that he's going to go into the methods of Aristotle's proofs, and I might run through some of these, but just for the sake of finishing the chapter today. And you'll see what I mean by how he applies his understanding of the rules of physics. So when Aristotle asserts that motion is not subject to generation and passing away, he means motion in the absolute sense. For he says that if a motion is produced in time, it should be considered, right, that it's preceded by another motion. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And it's being produced after. It's not. In other words, if something's going to move, like if a ball is going to fly from me to you, then I must have taken the ball and thrown it, right? I had a motion of my arm pushed the ball, right? So the motion exists by means of the latter motion. So a ball can't fly from me to you unless I throw the ball, right? And I can't throw the ball unless my brain decides to throw the ball, right? So there's always something that's making the motion happen, is the bottom line, right? Consequently, the first motion must be eternal, or else it will go on to infinity. What's crazy is and Rama will point that out and already has hinted, because it ends up being infinity anyway, right? But if there's motion in the world, something must have made the motion happen, right? Because that's how we see physics works, right? So for time is consequent upon and attached to motion. And there is no motion except in time, right? And if something moves, we define it by saying that at 101, it was here. At 102, it's over there, right? That's how you define motion, right? By using time. So if motion always had to have some motion before it, then time always has to have time before it. And it goes on and on like that. This is a method by means of which the eternity of the world is necessarily inferred. Therefore, if things are moving, something must have made it move. And if something made it move, something must have made that move. And so on and so on and so forth. So therefore, the world has to always have been here. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Method number one. Method number two, a second method. Now I'm on the middle paragraph. He asserts that the first matter, which is common to the four elements, this is Aristotelian physiology 101. Remember, there's four elements: earth, air, water, fire. But all of those are made up of some primeval matter from which all matter is made up of and divided into the four elements. So the first matter is not subject to generation and passing away, because if it was something, it would subject to generation. If the first matter could be made, then it must be made out of something. So then what's that something? Well, that something must be the first matter, but that something must have been made out of something, right? It's a very similar argument to the motion and time argument to the first one, right? But we have assumed that the matter in question, right? So the issue is, and the generated matter would have to be endowed with form, right? Because for something to happen, matter has to assume some form. That's one of the basic ideas of Aristotelian, physics. So, but we have assumed that the matter in question was matter not endowed with form, right? If there's a first matter, it has to have been matter that didn't have form, and then it took form and became a first matter. Now, such matter necessarily must not be generated from something. It is consequently, so that matter must be eternal, right? Because if it was formed from something before it, then that must have been something before it, et cetera, et cetera. So these considerations too render obligatory the eternity of the world. That's the second proof, which is very, very similar to the first proof, in the sense that Aristotle is saying, this is the rules of physics that I know, that I've proven and beyond a shadow of a doubt to Aristotle, and therefore the world must always have been here. A third method, he asserts that the matter of the heaven as a whole has no contraries, right? In other words, there's this kind of, you hear echoes of the idea of matter and antimatter, right? That everything, because of the idea that he's going to say in the middle of this paragraph, that in everything that passes away, the causing of its passing away consists in there being contraries in it, right? Well, if something dies, there must have been a force, an anti-life force that was fighting with the life force, and eventually the anti-life takes away the life, right? If matter, so any matter only ceases to exist because there's an antimatter, and I'm using a modern term, I admit that, but it's just against it. But the heavens, which are constantly going around, right, are going around in circles, right, and they have no contrary, as has been demonstrated. Accordingly, as there are no contraries in this sphere, it is not subject to passing away. It is something that's always going to keep on going, right? Now, what is not subject to passing away, if it never goes away, it's also never going to come into existence, right? That's an assumption that Aristotle makes, and it's part of one of his basic physiologic rules, which doesn't really have. It's something we can't really explain in our own understanding of physics. But so in other words, several propositions he puts together. Everything that's subject to, if something could come about, it must be something that can stop existing. If it's something that can pass away, it must be something that can come about. Everything, if it has never been created, right? If it has never come into existence, then it's never going to go away, right? And if it's this, so therefore, if it's never going to go away, it must have never come into existence. If it never comes into an existence and it does exist, right? Then it must have always been here, right? So again, this too is a method of the eternity of the world. That's method number 3. Again, he's using his rules of physics, right? Which he proves however you want to. Go read Aristotle if you want to read how I prove them. But he's using what he understood the laws of physics to be to prove that the world must have always been here. A fourth method. I'm going to try to roll through this one, but you're going to see a very, very similar theme. He's just basically going to use, as we've seen in the first 3, another law of physics, or Aristotelian physics. He asserts, with respect to everything that is produced in time, right, the possibility of its being produced precedes in time the production of the thing itself, right? In other words, anything that happens, it happens because it could happen, right? It has to be possible, right? If something is impossible, then it can't happen, right? So in other words, if there's a table, right, then someone must have conceived in his mind how I can build a table. I can chop down a tree, I can make pieces of wood, I can take a couple of hammers and nails and make a table, right? So similarly, with respect to everything that changes, the possibility of its changing precedes in time the change itself, right? There always has to be the possibility that such change can exist. If it's impossible, if it's inconceivable, then it can never happen, right? So in other words, everything that happens is therefore possible beforehand. From this premise, he made a necessary inference as to the perpetuity of circular motion, of its having no end and no beginning, right? Which he discussed earlier. We had that earlier too, that the only motion that you can just keep on going straight is a circular motion. But his later followers in their turn made it clear by means of this premise that the world was eternal. How? Because before the world came into being, its reduction in time must have been either possible or necessary or impossible, right? It must have been something that either could be, right, or has to be, or can't be, right? Now, if it had to be, right, then there could never have been a time that the world didn't exist, right? Because it has to be, right? In other words, if the rules of physics dictate that a universe should exist as we see a universe, right? If the rules of physics say that this is how this world has to exist, then the world had to have always existed. Because why, at this point in time, does necessity dictate the world should be? And then 10 minutes beforehand, necessity did not dictate that the world should be. It doesn't make sense, right? If you assume that the rules of physics always applied, right? Same point, right? If its production in time was impossible, then the world would never exist, right? It could, right? And if it was possible, then what was the substratum for this possibility? So you can also say, well, the world could be, but it didn't have to be this way. Kind of like nowadays, like the multiverse theory, right? The world could be a million different ways. The one we're in happens to be the one that's how we see it, right? So if it's possible, then who's thinking about this possibility, right? Where is this possibility existing? right? There must be an existent thing that is the substratum of this possibility, and in virtue of which it is said of the thing that is possible. Who's the guy hanging around saying a universe could exist that looks like this, right? Right? There must have been. So this is a so so uh, so the this is a very powerful method for establishing the eternity of the world. If that being was thinking about it, then why would it be now and not 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1 billion years ago, or 1 trillion years ago? So it must be that it was always there, right? So, and then how an intelligent man from the Mutakalman thought he had solved this problem. And he said that the possibility resides in the agent and not in the thing that is the object of action, right? That the possibility existed in, so to speak, God's mind. There was an existent possibility there, but there was no actual universe to be. For with respect to everything produced in time, the possibility of its being produced precedes in time the thing itself. And similarly, the agent that produced it, there is the possibility to produce that which has produced before it has done so. So that would be one understanding, one way of refuting this Aristotelian proof. I'm going to go to. There are methods. There are also, these are the four methods that Aristotle himself used. I just finished the long paragraph on 287. I know I paraphrased a little for the sake of time. But there are also methods then later Aristotelian thinkers used to prove Aristotelian's thought process. So what are those? One of them is as follows. If God, may his name be sublime, has produced the world in time after its having been non-existent, right? Then God himself must have been an agent in potentia before he had created the world, right? And after he had created, he became an agent in actu. In other words, if you're going to claim that God created the world in time, right, then before that moment in time, God was hanging around wherever he was hanging around and had the ability to make a world, right? And then all of a sudden, in one moment, he says, I'm going to make a world. And now he's the God in actu, right? Now he's the God that actually made the world, right? So God had therefore passed from potentiality to actuality, right? God, there was a major change. God at first was a potential guy, and then he was a real doer guy, right? Right? And then that would be causing a change in God, right? And we can't change God. So if God can't change, then he must have always been in actu. There must have always been a universe. I'm at the top of 288. That was one of their post-Aristotelian proofs for Aristotle's idea. Another method, they say, an agent acts at one time and does not act at another only because of the impediments or incentives, right? What is it, right, that makes you or me change course, right? You're driving down the street and your Google Maps says, there's traffic jam, make a right turn, right? Go take another route, right? That's happened to all of us, right? What makes us decide to take another route? A change happens. Like something says, right? Something tells me, I want to get from point A to point B. There's an accident on the road that's going to make it take a half an hour instead of 10 minutes. So I drive around, right? But what incentive would God have had to change action inside? Before the world came to be, I didn't have a world. And now something changed and I decided to make a world. That doesn't make sense. How could God have an incentive? Right? You and I have an incentive. We want to go buy a pizza, right? God doesn't have an incentive. So it doesn't make sense. Okay, that's the second paragraph on the page. The next one, another method. They say his acts, may he be exalted, are most perfect. There's no defect. There's nothing in them without an object. There's nothing extra. This is a notion reiterated always by Aristotle, who says that nature is wise and doesn't do anything without an object, that it does everything in the most perfect possible way. Accordingly, it follows that the existent in question is the most perfect existent. It must be that nature is perfect. It's exactly the way it's supposed to be. If it's perfect and God's wisdom is perpetual, as is his essence, then the world should always exist. So these are the proofs. And so that ends Aristotle's proofs for is anyone here convinced that the world is eternal yet?
No,
All
didn't
right.
convince me.
Yeah, I mean, all of the arguments, right, and of the believers, I'm at a short paragraph near the bottom of 288, that you may encounter are ramifications of these methods and stem from one of them. So anything else you might read, Rambam assures you, if you want to go read it, fine, but don't bother, because I'm telling you, anything else you're going to read that supports the eternity of the world's view of Aristotle is going to be some variation of the arguments that I just laid out to you, right? They also say, in order to prove that the opposed doctrines are disgraceful, right? In other words, okay, so now right? If they claim all these proofs, they also want to prove the opposing view, right? With the opposing view of ex nihilo, right? Right? They want to say that they're no good, and to prove them, they'll say, how could the deity be idle and not do a thing in any respect whatsoever, and then cause a happening to take place in the course of the? In other words, are you telling me he was just hanging around and doing nothing, right? Right? How does that make sense? He's the perfect God. He's doing. He has the ability to do like things that we can't even comprehend. What are you telling me? He was sitting and twiddling his thumbs, drinking a margarita on the beach. I mean, what was he doing? Right? How can you say that about God? Right? So for if you were to say that, and well, what do you want to say? Well, maybe he created other worlds before this one, and like the millions of the numbers of mustard seeds, whatever, which are tiny little seeds. If you have a bucket, there's like bazillions of them in the little bucket. And each of these worlds remained in existence, and then he destroyed one, then he made a new one. I mean, there are traditions in Chazal that say similar ideas. What they mean is a different story. Maybe we'll deal with that another time. But that's absurd, right? Right? Because then you're saying that all those worlds weren't perfect, right? Why did he have to make one world that was no good? And I don't like this one. Poof. Make a new one. I don't like this one. Poof. Make a new. I don't like this one. And now he made ours, and ours is perfect. Like it just doesn't make sense, right? His infant would have been as if you were to say that God created. Okay, so then okay. I'm sorry. I was making the wrong argument here. This is a very important argument, and this is actually a refutation of those who will say it. And but let me read it carefully. For if you were to say, for instance, that God created many worlds, the number being of the mustard seed required to fill the global atmosphere, in other words, millions and millions of worlds. So each of these worlds has remained in existence a number of years, equal to that of the mustard seeds required to fill it. So in other words, what we're living in now is like a continuous act of creation, right? If you think about this for a moment, some people argue, right, when they debate, when people tried to claim that the world is only 5,700 whatever years old, right? The world is only approximately 6,000 years old based on a simple reading of the Torah. So some people, but what about science? It shows the world is billions of years old, right? So they'll say, well, you know what? When God created the world, he made a world that looked like it was billions of years old, right? Right. So this is an argument that you'll find some people positing, right? I'm not going to say who, but there are some well-known Jewish thinkers that have used this argument to refute the geological argument about the age of the universe, right? So Rambam says, if this was the case, as soon as we affirm the inauguration of that which exists after non-existence, there's no difference between one's positing that this happened hundreds of thousands of years since or at a very recent time, right? If you're going to argue like that, then the world could just as easily have been created yesterday, right? Right? There's no reason to go to 6,000 years. God could have made the world yesterday and made it look like, and he created you and I with all of our life experiences and memories may just be a joke, right? So there's no point in having a God that creates and not creates and creates not this constant creation. Accordingly, this is also a way by means of which those who believe in the eternity of the world prove the incongruity of opposed doctrines. So they also argue through drawing an inference from what was universally admitted in the past among all nations, right? They'll say, right, all men, like that's Aristotle says, all men explicitly affirm the perpetuity and permanence of the heavens. All people say the heavens are permanent, are forever. And when they became aware that they were not subject to coming about and passing away, they asserted that that must be where God is, because God is always and forever. They attributed the heavens to him in order to indicate their perpetuity. So he uses a cultural argument. If when Aristotle's saying, if we go to some faraway pagan group in the middle of wherever, what was ever far away to Aristotle's days, the people would say the heavens are forever and the creator is forever. Okay, so these are by means of universally admitted beliefs. So now we've let it out. We've described Aristotle's philosophical proofs and those that followed in his path for the foreverness, the eternity of the world, and we are going to I'm going to continue more with Aristotle's this whole idea, and eventually we're going to get to Rambam's refutation of Aristotle and why he feels that his Aristotle's proofs are no good, and how the idea of ex nihilo, the idea which Rambam says is with the Torah's idea that the world was created at a given time. I think that's enough for tonight. I know it's a but we went through a lot, but it's important. And the main point being is whether you remember these arguments or not. And I know I said this a million times. That's because I really want to drive this into everybody's mind. And that is that Aristotle is making a fundamental assumption. And that assumption is that the rules of physics that we see, right, are the rules that have always been. They're necessary rules, as opposed to what Rambam is going to pose, which is really one of Rambam's most important contributions to modern philosophy, is the idea that when the world is created ex nihilo, the rules of physics are also created ex nihilo, right? The rules of physics are created at the same time. So there's no, so in order to make an argument about time, there was no time beforehand. Time is something that we measure today. Didn't exist before. All of Aristotle's arguments completely fall apart when you make the assumption that God made up the rules of physics. He could have made a world that things fall up instead of down, but that's not the world that he made, and those rules went into place at the time of creation. All right, I think that's enough for today.
Just a quick question. Well, why do they say that Maimonides was an Aristotelian when we're seeing that he apparently doesn't at least follow?
Well, that's a good question, but in almost everything else we've had until now, he follows Aristotle, right? Right. This is the fundamental area where Rambam takes him on. Where Rambam says Aristotle's a great dude. He's really smart. I like everything. In other words, his rules of physics, the Rambam accepts hook, line, and sinker. Like that's how the world works, right? But he takes him on specifically in this specific area, which is really important because for a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, because he fundamentally lays down one of the most basic tenets of monotheism, Judaism specifically, and monotheism in general, and that's creation of the world ex nihilo, right? Right. It's important because we see that no matter how much respect Rambam had for Aristotle, right, he still, he was ready to go up against him when he had to, and this is the famous place where Rambam takes him on and strongly and at length, which is we're in the meat of it right now.
So Aristotle did not believe in a creator. Is that correct?
He believed there was a God that was the prime mover that made it all happen.
Yeah.
But that creator was always around, right? And the world is always going to be, and it always was. But there's some kind of a force that Aristotle calls God that makes it all happen. Now, I mean, one could argue, and after we go through the Rambam, we'll see if he presents a good enough argument for this, that Aristotle's idea doesn't make that much sense either. Like, what do you mean it was always there? Like, once he's always there, these arguments are, trust me, these philosophical arguments, that's exactly what we're going to be doing the next, I don't know, 8 chapters or so. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be a lot of fun. Any other questions or comments?
So I'm trying to figure out the processes. So Tehillim is not asking God to do anything. It's a way by which we can create a better world.
Yes, and we work better selves, right? Better selves, better people, better world, and we are worshiping God, right? We are worshiping in the sense that we are acknowledging his greatness, we're learning more about him so that we become more and more in awe of God, right? And it's a process of worship, right? Not that God gets anything out of it, right? Not like the pagan idea that we give him a sacrifice and God needs blood or something, right? But the point that we're worshiping him, and we become better in the process. The world becomes better in the process. So prayers do get answered because that's how the world works. Anyway, but yeah, so
does that assume that there's a goodness in the world? I mean, what if there's not good? I mean, you're assuming that when we get better, things get better. Isn't that a matter of faith as opposed to anything logical?
it's an assumption, and it's part of what James Diamond said might have been called into question with the Holocaust. I think you're pointing out something really good. In other words, the assumption that if we worship God, we'll get better and the world will get better, it does assume that people are basically good, right? And that if we worship God, we'll get there. But that assumption could have been called into question by horrific events such as the Holocaust and or other terrible, terrible cataclysmic events of suffering in this world. And where Rambam's and where he argues at least, and I didn't read his whole book. I read like some parts of it and I read the basic thesis and I heard him give a talk online. But his thesis argues that Rambam's philosophy falls short, despite him being a huge fan of Rambam because he writes tons of books about him. But he kind of argues about. I don't know what my own opinion is on that matter until I read his whole book. But I forget what it's called, and I apologize. I'll have to look it up and let you know another time. What else? Any other comments? If there are no more, we'll close it up and let's hope we hear better news. All right, have a good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Be well. Bye bye.
Thank you, Saul.
Thank you, Saul.
Yeah. Bye bye.